Despite the tremendous success that we saw in this past election and voters supporting pro-equality candidates, we're here today to highlight the slate of anti-LGBTQ bills we have seen in state houses so far this year. These bills are similar to those we have seen in recent years. They're not designed to solve a problem or address constituent concerns. Rather, like the bathroom bills before them, anti-LGBTQ extremists are taking painstaking efforts to legislate against LGBTQ people because they think it will score them political points. Yesterday, the Montana House of Representatives passed an anti-transgender bill, HB 112, that would ban transgender athletes from participating in sports. This bill now heads to the state Senate after less than 1 week's consideration in the House, and before the legislature has seriously considered legislation to address COVID-19 or provide economic relief. As you will hear more from Kate Oakley, who's our legislative director, or state legislative director, the Human Rights Campaign is working hard to defeat these bills, defeat these anti-LGBTQ bills that effectively are designed as a political wedge, not as serious proposals. But as we've seen in the last 5 years, their attempts will not work. They will lose these fights, and we are wagering them at all. They're posing economic, reputational, and legal harm to their states, while they're doing nothing but sowing fear and division. They're propagated by extremist groups like the Heritage Foundation. And these bills are just unjust as they are unnecessary. We should all appreciate that everyone deserves equal access to healthcare and equal access to the opportunity to play sports, regardless of their gender identity. And there is much more important issues to be addressing in our schools right now, especially as we're dealing with a global pandemic. Our focus should be on protecting and educating our children, not teaching them that they or their classmates are less than anyone else. Simply put, this legislation, these series of bills that we're seeing, they're not solutions to a problem. They're actually trying to find a problem that doesn't exist. Anti-trans sports bills and similar discriminatory legislation are the newest types of anti-LGBTQ legislation we're seeing. And we're seeing this across the state. They lost on marriage. They lost on the bathroom bills. And now they ultimately will lose here as well. But by prioritizing this discriminatory and doomed anti-LGBTQ agenda, these legislators are putting their own constituents and state economies in greater jeopardy. Our study about the economic impact of the bathroom bills in North Carolina and Texas shows that these bills were economically catastrophic. The Associated Press, for example, projected that the North Carolina bathroom bill would lose them nearly $4 billion in revenues over 10 years. And the Texas Association of Business estimated $8.5 billion in losses, risking 185,000 jobs in the process. These are economically disastrous bills. Anti-transgender legislation also, in addition to being economically disastrous, endangers an already vulnerable population. Last year was the deadliest year on record for the transgender community. At least 44 transgender and non-binary people were killed in this country. Most of them were Black and brown. These victims are not statistics. They're real people, people who did not deserve to have their lives taken from them. And attacks like these bills only fuel the destructive forces of stigma that shatters the bright futures and families beyond repair. Anti-transgender bills are dangerous, they're despicable, and they're unscientific. They help no one, and they do a great deal of harm. They harm our friends, our neighbors, our families, and our loved ones. The Human Rights Campaign and our partners are deeply committed to fighting against discriminatory legislation across this nation. As we have seen again and again and again, equality is a winning issue. It's a winning issue in the 2020 elections. And as legislators in states across the country know, when equity and inclusion are a priority, communities and economies thrive. Last year, states across the country passed pro-LGBTQ legislation, which betters the lives of millions of people in the process. While more work remains to be done, it is clear that welcoming states are ultimately better for all, better for people who live there, better for visitors, better for business. We cannot and we will not allow these coordinated attacks of extremists to roll back the progress that we have made in this country. We have come way too far, and we have too much at stake to let the politics of hatred and division win. Now, we have a presentation for you from Kate Oakley, and she's going to go through the details of what we're seeing across the country. We're seeing a lot of bills, anti-LGBTQ bills across this country, but you should be assured that the Human Rights Campaign and our partners are committed to beating back and fighting back against these bills all across the country. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kate.
Thank you, Alphonso. Thank you, everybody, for being here. You know, as Alphonso says, these are really incredibly frustrating and difficult bills. And so thank you for being here to learn a little bit more about how these bills operate in the states. As Wyatt said as well, we're going to have questions at the end. So if you have questions that come up as we are going through, please feel free to ask them at the end. We'd love to answer your questions. So first, I'm going to just talk a little bit about what we're seeing across the country and how the last 5-6 years in particular have really been the story that we can learn from what the last 6 years have been telling us about where our opponents are going and what they're trying to achieve. And the trends in terms of what kinds of legislation are being introduced, what kinds of types of anti-transgender legislation are being introduced, and what we're seeing in 2021 so far. I'll tell you that the state legislative work is extremely dynamic and things are constantly changing. And we have updates to the things that you've seen from today. So we'll walk through all of that as we go through. This is, I hope, a helpful picture to just sort of set the stage about what we've been facing over the course of the last several years. In 2015, as marriage equality was on its way to be in front of the Supreme Court, we saw the beginning of what was a huge backlash against the LGBTQ community in state legislatures. Now, the general population was overwhelmingly in favor of marriage equality. I think many folks at that point felt that marriage equality was inevitable. And so again, this isn't a controversial question. The question of whether or not marriage was a good idea, honestly, at that point was not really controversial any longer. But what we saw was that state legislatures were really responding to the idea that marriage might be coming soon to a state near them. And so we saw what began a real influx of anti-LGBTQ legislation. If you can remember back to 2015, that was the year of the Indiana RFRA. So the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, that was introduced in Indiana that became so controversial and infamous. 2016, the tact really changed, and that was the year of the bathroom bills. That was the year of North Carolina passing HB2, and this trend toward trying to target trans people really came into the fore in terms of the state legislatures having trans people sort of in their sights as they're passing this legislation or introducing this legislation. And unfortunately, that has continued. I think it's helpful always as we're having these conversations about bad bills to say, hey, we also passed good bills. Last year in 2020, we passed the Virginia Values Act, which was comprehensive non-discrimination in Virginia as the first Southern state to have comprehensive non-discrimination that included LGBTQ people. And that bill actually also added additional protections for protected characteristics beyond the LGBTQ community, which is a story for another day. But I just want to mention that there is ongoing good legislation. The bad legislation, unfortunately, takes up way too much time and attention. These are real threats, and honestly, even just having them be introduced is harmful, even if they're not passed. The rhetoric that comes up around these bills can be really harmful for people to have to listen to. The three types of anti-LGBTQ bills that we're going to talk about today, and I should say that there are lots of different ways that state legislators approach these issues in terms of trying to hold back protections from trans folks. But these are three that we're going to talk about today. The first is anti-transgender sports bills. This is something that we've seen in particular over the course of the last few years, although there had been a sort of a smattering starting in really 2016. And these are bills that would forbid transgender youth and in some cases transgender adults from participating in athletics consistent with their gender identity. I should say here, and we can discuss more later, the NCAA and other sports leagues have policies that they've adopted in terms of how that they want to address the question of how a transgender athlete should compete most fairly and participate in collegiate athletics. And some of these bills, including the bill that was in Idaho and the bill that is currently being entertained in Montana, would actually regulate not only public schools, but also collegiate athletics. And so these bills would put the public institutions that are of higher education that are participating in NCAA athletics at odds with the NCAA policy. And anti-transgender medical care bans. This is actually really one of the newer trends. We've only really seen these over the last couple years. And these bills are trying to insert themselves between trans youth and their doctor by saying that trans youth who are looking for access to best practice, evidence-based, medically necessary care should not be allowed to receive that care because there is sort of this hypothesis out there that children are being turned trans or that children will regret having transitioned. And this real emphasis on feeling that this is something that's coming from outside a trans youth and that's being imposed upon them, their transness is being imposed upon them, and that the argument goes that you're trying to protect those trans youth from the adults around them who are sort of trying to turn them trans, if that makes sense. And it is really coming between the youth and their doctor. And so we'll talk more about these, but one of these bills was just being entertained in Montana and looks like it's been defeated. And I think it's really important to point out that in Montana, one of the strongest voices against this bill was the local, the state chapter of pediatricians who said, this is ridiculous. You need to let us be able to practice medicine and please don't get between us and our patients. And then finally, I want to mention identity documents. This is a much smaller percentage of the bills that we're seeing, but unfortunately, one of these bills was passed last year, also in Idaho. This is a bill that makes it harder for a trans person to update their birth certificate or their driver's license to reflect their correct gender identity. And these bills, the bill that was passed in Idaho last year was passed in response to a court ruling that actually said that Idaho's existing practice was insufficient and told Idaho that they had to update their practice to make it easier for a trans person to update their birth certificate. And in response, the legislature passed instead a law that made it impossible, and that was then immediately challenged in court. I want to mention this because this is something, while it's a significantly smaller trend, it is like these other two in that A, it targets trans people, and B, it's targeting trans people in a way that frankly is sort of nonsensical and gratuitous. They knew perfectly well, Idaho knew perfectly well that this bill was contrary to the ruling that the court had made and that they were setting themselves up for ongoing litigation, and they chose to do that anyway. And this slide, and I know that the key here is hard to read, we'll walk through this, but what this slide is showing is how the kind of anti-transgender legislation that we've been dealing with has changed over the course of the last several years. I mentioned that 2015 was the year of the Indiana RFRA, and that year was really focused on religious refusals and in particular marriage and the ability to deny marriage-related services, for example, like wedding cake bakers. And you can see that in 2015, there wasn't a ton of anti-transgender, specifically anti-transgender legislation that was introduced. That blue bar to the left, a sort of lighter blue, that's the total amount of legislation that was sort of specifically anti-trans that was introduced in that year. And the vast majority of the legislation that was introduced in 2015, and then again, you'll see that in 2016, was a really high level of legislation that targeted trans people in the areas of bathrooms, locker rooms, sports. In those days, it was bathrooms. These were really overwhelmingly about bathrooms. Some of them would also talk about sports, but to the extent that they talked about sports, it was mostly talking about locker rooms. So the bathroom locker room question was very intertwined, particularly in 2015. And then HB2 was in 2016. And that was the year that these bathroom bills really kind of took off. In 2017, we saw a lot of them introduced, but very few of them moved. I think the lesson that North Carolina learned as a result of HB2 was that, people saw through these arguments. The North Carolina legislature felt very confident that the HB2 was going to be a winning issue for them. They really thought that that was the case. And when that turned out that it was actually the opposite, and that North Carolina ended up becoming infamous for this bathroom bill, I mean, internationally infamous for this bathroom bill, that other states then, it didn't make sense to move forward with it. People understood that, this was in fact discrimination, and that it was discrimination that people just would not tolerate and would not look kindly upon. And so the bathroom bills, as you can see, really then sort of tailed off 2018 and 2019. And then they bounced back with a vengeance. So we'll talk more about that in just a second. Then the bar after that is the child gender identity. These are the bills that I was speaking of that are prohibiting a trans youth from accessing medically necessary, best practice gender affirming care. And as I said, we didn't really see any of this in 2015, 2016, 2017. This is something that really grew. It started coming out in 2018, but then in 2020, it really kind of exploded. And we saw a lot of these terrible bills introduced across the country. And then going back to this bathrooms, locker rooms, sports question, you can see in 2019, and then again, particularly in 2020, we had these bathroom bills just bounce back with a vengeance. It was in 2020, as you could see from that light blue bar, we had a historically high level of anti-transgender legislation introduced. After what as you can see, was a pretty significant decline, where we just saw states, as I said, in 2016, North Carolina really felt that they had a winning issue with HB2. When it turned out that that wasn't the case, states really backed off. And they may have continued to introduce these bills, but they just weren't moving forward at that same level that certainly they were in 2016. And I think folks really felt like they understood that this kind of discrimination was going to have consequences. And in 2020, they sort of bounced right back, and we have all of these sort of new-ish ideas and this sort of novel approaches to discriminating against transgender folks, in particular transgender youth, like just a really sort of strong focus on transgender youth in both keeping them from accessing medical care and then keeping them from being able to play sports. When you see that gray bar in 2020, it's not bathroom bills anymore. That's really sports is what you see. And then that final bar is just showing other anti-transgender legislation that was introduced in those years. And that's where something like the birth certificate bill that I mentioned, that would fall on that other bar. So this map, I think we made yesterday or late the night before, and is already out of date because of how quickly we have these bills introduced. But I think this gives you a good sense of where we're seeing anti-transgender bills, sports bills introduced so far this year. I anticipate that we will see this map color in significantly more. The darkness of the color blue indicates how many bills. North Dakota and Tennessee each have 2 or 3 anti-transgender bills introduced. The others have 1 so far as of the making of this map. And we see them in all of these states, but as I said, we very much anticipate we're going to see them in more states. It's still very early in the legislative session, and some states many states have actually not hit their filing deadline. So we're anticipating seeing a lot more. And then this map, again, from not so long ago, has the anti-transgender medical care ban bills. And these are the states that had introduced them as of the making of that map. And again, we anticipate that we'll have many more states that are introducing these bills as we go forward. So I think a really important question to ask here is, where are these coming from? And the LGBTQ community has always had our opponents, those of us who are advocating for equality, we've always had our opponents who are motivated and well-funded. And as I said, in 2015, the push against marriage had fairly clearly failed. And so they needed a new direction. What was the new direction they chose? They chose going after trans people. And that was what HB2 in North Carolina was all about. When that frittered away, they needed something new. They went to anti-trans legislation targeting youth. But these bills are absolutely being driven by some national anti-LGBTQ organizations. We will share them with you in a minute. And I think one of the things that is notable is the language of these bills looks very similar across the country. So these are not, it's not that these legislators are waking up and having these identical ideas. They're having these bills pushed to them as part of our opponent's national strategy. And also, I think it's really important, just as I was saying around marriage in 2015, the general population overwhelmingly supported marriage by the time the Obergefell decision came down. So the influx of anti-bills that we saw had nothing to do with what the people were asking for. It was about the politicians believing that they had an angle and trying to create sort of this political space for themselves to be pulling back against equality. And that is absolutely true here as well. LGBTQ equality is broadly popular, even among Republicans who prefer pro-equality candidates. And specifically, there's overwhelming support for trans equality. And so these are not bills that are, people are asking for. These are bills that politicians are putting forward because they want to be able to try to claw back equality bit by bit. And also, we talked a little bit about North Carolina. There is a major risk of harm for states that pass these bills. And that's something that has continued on. And finally, I think the most important thing to know about all of these is that this is about generating fear. I mean, very much to the point that Alphonso was making at the top of the call. These bills are about fear. They are not about facts. Our opposition is looking for something to do, and they don't care that they're creating a political issue in order to do it. So in terms of who's behind these bills, these are some of the organizations that we know have been involved in creating and spreading the anti-transgender legislation that we're speaking of today. The Heritage Foundation, one of the people behind the South Dakota bill last year, made it clear that he had gotten the idea for his bill from this Heritage Foundation summit. The Alliance Defending Freedom has testified in favor of these bills, and in some cases has offered litigation support in case the state ends up in litigation because the bills are clearly unconstitutional. That ADF has offered to help with their litigation. And the American Principles Project in the 2020 campaign invested a lot of money, more than $3 million, on a media campaign pushing an anti-trans sports narrative, and they lost every race in which they spent that money. So here on the screen, we have some examples of some of the bills that are affiliated with some of these different groups. And as I said, LGBTQ equality itself is broadly popular. The graph that says here is if I knew an elected official opposed LGBTQ equality, this would make me less favorable toward them in green and more favorable toward them in orange. And as you can see in this series of swing states, overwhelmingly, knowing that someone opposed LGBTQ equality would make that person less favorable for these voters. And that also includes Republicans in these swing states, where you can see that Republicans overwhelmingly are less favorable to a candidate that opposes LGBTQ equality. And as you can see, it's not close either. This is somewhat significant margins here. And I also think it's important to say specifically, there's overwhelming endorsement of rights for trans people. Sometimes when we talk about the LGBTQ community, there can be a little bit of gray area about who supports what for whom. I think it's really important to say that more than 90% of voters in these battleground states support making sure trans people have equal access to medical care. And also, just to sort of come back to this point about the kind of harm that states are taking on when they take on these bills. You know, as I said, these are invented proposals. These are not addressing real problems. And so to have a situation in which you are putting forward a bill that you know perfectly well is going to bring litigation upon the state, that state is going to have to defend in court, when there's not even a justification in reality, there are no facts to support that there's a need for these bills. I think it really highlights how hollow this is, how frankly discriminatory these are. There's really no reason to be moving forward with these bills other than you're just trying to hurt people. And particularly when you're inviting this kind of economic and reputational harm, as both Wyatt and I think Alphonso referred to earlier on, we've got North Carolina and Texas. Those are both places where there were reports that were done that were evaluating how much the states had to lose. And in both cases, it was literally billions of dollars. And, you know, I think it's also important to say that in Idaho last year, they had the HB 500, which was this anti-trans sports bill, and the NCAA came out against it and said, look, this is contrary to the way the NCAA does this, and we think that this is wrong. And they issued a statement against the bill and asked for it to not be passed. Also, a collection of former Idaho attorneys general came together to sign a letter that said that they believed that these bills were unconstitutional. So, you know, I think it's important to say there's just no rationale. It's all harm. All of the things that will come from passing these bills are risks of harm, and that there's no real reason to be taking those risks because there's no evidence that there's a problem. And then finally, I also just want to reiterate again that these proposals that are targeting transgender people because of misunderstanding and dislike of trans people, that's anti-transgender animus, and that's unconstitutional. And the Idaho bill was heard in district court, and there was an injunction that was issued in which the court was very clear that that's how they saw this bill. They said, you know, between this bill and the birth certificate bill, it's clear the legislature had some motivation to go after transgender people. There's no justification for this bill. There's no need for it. And so all that's left is to say that it must have been driven by anti-transgender animus, which is unconstitutional. And so that bill is currently enjoined from being able to go into effect. So these states are also inviting legal harm. And so why are these politicians doing this, right? They don't have the support of the general populace. All they have to take on is risk. But the reason they're doing this is because it's just the same old, same old. It's the newest front of the same old attacks. As Alphonso said, it started with marriage, it went to bathroom bills, and now we're here. That doesn't make these any more real problems than marriage or the bathroom bills were. This is very much about scoring political points at the expense of the most vulnerable. And they know they're on the wrong side of history and that they're losing ground. And so with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Wyatt to moderate questions.
Yes, thank you, Kate, and thank you, Alphonso, for both of your presentations. The way that this will work, if you have a question for either Alphonso or Kate, please put it in the chat, and we'll make sure that I call on you. Everyone will get an opportunity to ask any questions that they have. I just want to make sure we're doing this in an orderly fashion and there's no crosstalk. So feel free I'll give everyone a minute or so to put their inquiries or questions in the chat. You don't have to put the full question, just let me know that you'd like to ask one. John from Bay Area Reporter, would you like to ask your question? Go ahead.
Hello? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Yes. So I would like to ask Cathryn, what would you say are among the most dangerous bills that are being considered right now, you know, regardless of their chances of passing?
Do you mean like what types or what specific bill numbers?
Like what specific bill numbers?
Yeah, well, right now, what's really alarming is the sports bill that's in Montana. Montana was one of the earlier states to really get rolling on this year. And they had both an anti-trans medical bill and an anti-trans sports bill that have both been very serious challenges. And I guess I'm actually answering both questions, which is to say that the medical care ban did not make it through the House, well, it's done now, we think, for the year. But the sports bill did make it through and is going to be likely to be heard in the Senate pretty soon. And, why do I think that those are the most dangerous? I do think that that sports bill is dangerous, moving forward into the Montana Senate. But I think they're both dangerous. I think even if they don't pass, having these bills be introduced is really harmful to trans youth. It's really harmful to be hurt, to hear that you're not welcome, that people are afraid of you. People are so fundamentally misunderstand who you are, to the extent that they would take these dramatic measures and go to the legislature and try to hurt you in the legislature. That they would try to tell your doctor that your doctor could be fined. In Montana, the Montana bill is about fining. In some other states, it's about losing their license. And there were actually some states last year that said that they would even put a doctor in jail for providing medically necessary best practice care. And so, even though that bill, it does not look like it's going to become a law in Montana this year, I think it's really dangerous that it was even entertained as seriously as it was. I think the message is really harmful. And, I think what was impactful in Montana was that we had parents who were coming out and saying, look, I'm just trying to do what's right for my kid. And you had doctors who came out and said, look, we're just trying to do what's right for our patients. And the state legislature is not in a better position to decide what makes sense for these kids than their parents and their doctors. And so maybe you could just leave this to us. And that argument was persuasive there. So the Montana bills we are particularly concerned about right now. There are others that are certainly percolating. There have been some in South Dakota, some in North Dakota that are all percolating right now. And there are more that their legislative sessions just haven't gotten up and running yet, but that they will be major threats once those legislatures are together. I suspect some of the scariest bills of this year, we likely haven't even had introduced yet.
This is Alphonso. If I could just add on to what Kate just said, because I think the point that she made in the presentation is so incredibly important. These are national organizations that are attempting to infiltrate state legislatures and advance bias. That's what they're doing. So one of the reasons why we're so deeply concerned is because if these bills pass in Montana and South Dakota and North Dakota, they use those bills as models to try to expand their reach throughout the country. We saw this with the constitutional amendments against same-sex couples having the right to marry years ago, right? So they would pass one constitutional amendment and use that model to basically replicate what they were doing in certain states. And the impact is very real for these kids. If these kids are unable to receive the medical care that they need or unable to participate in the sports consistent with their gender identity, it affects their entire lives. And so we're fighting each of these bills individually, but let's keep in mind, this is a national strategy by anti-LGBTQ activists.
Thank you, Alphonso. And I don't see any additional questions in the chat, but wanted to, James, I'm seeing from the Dallas Voice. James, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, y'all. Yeah, I'm wondering, Kat, are the medical bills that are proposed, are they sweeping or are they piecemeal, like slowly tapping away?
That's a great question, and they look different in different places. One of the sort of, I would say, the most common constellation of things that these bills do is that they prohibit any kind of gender affirming care. So that includes puberty blockers, it includes hormone therapy. In some cases, and this is a little bit less common, but it is certainly true in some cases, it would prohibit mental health care. And then they all go on to talk about surgery and imply that gender confirming surgery is happening for young people, which it simply isn't. That's not, surgery is not recommended for young folks. And And so like they're sort of using this sort of prospect of surgery as something that they're, this is happening for very young children. And that's just simply not true. It's just a lot of fear mongering. But what they do seem to really be missing in this piece is that a lot of them say, well, we want for these young people to be able to make these decisions as adults. And we want for them to be able to make sure that they're adults before they're making any decisions about what they want their body to be like. And I think the kicker, there was last year in South Dakota, one of these bills was being considered, and there was a lovely piece of testimony that came from a young person who said that puberty blockers are the pause button they're looking for. Puberty blockers were what allowed me to be of an age where I could decide for myself before I took the next step. And so by them denying me puberty blockers, they're achieving exactly the opposite of what it is that they said they wanted to do. And I think that's really important too, right? So this whole constellation of things that they're doing, some of them are very aggressive in terms of what they're including. I mean, even like talk therapy. And then others of them are a little bit more limited, but that all of them are really misunderstanding what care looks like for trans youth, and that they're really trying to make it look very scary in order to justify stepping between a young person and their doctor, a young person and their parents and their doctor. And so it's a combination of sort of super aggressive, but for the most part, actually, they're very comprehensive limitations.